Hey, welcome back. Omar Khadr may have settled his case with the Canadian government, but there is still a $134 million judgment against him in a U.S. court. This week, a Toronto judge rejected a request to freeze Khadr's assets, his new assets, until that case moves forward. The request came from the widow of U.S. soldier Christopher Speer, who was killed in a firefight in Afghanistan in 2002, and from another soldier, Lane Morris, who was injured in that same firefight, in which Omar Khadr was involved as well. So what's next in Khadr's legal battle? Will he have to hand over any of his $10.5 million to Lane Morris or the Speer family? Joining me now in Toronto is one of Omar Khadr's lawyers, Kingman Phillips. Nice to see you, Mr. Phillips.
Nice to see you.
Okay, so yesterday the Ontario Superior Court rejected this attempt, an injunction, I guess it was essentially, to freeze Mr. Khadr's assets. Was that a surprise to you? Why do you think they went ahead and did that?
Well, I think there are several reasons why that injunction didn't have a chance to go ahead, but it was defeated on the basis of lack of evidence, as Mr. Whitling pointed out when he gave his press conference. And I was not surprised by that, no.
Okay, so what do you think will happen next then? Because obviously the Speer family, Mr. Morris, they're quite intent on going ahead and trying to get standing to get some money from Mr. Khadr. What do you expect would be the next legal step?
Well, there's standard sets of enforcement techniques to have the judgment from Utah recognized in Canada. I think they have, and I think there's probably a universal legal view that they don't have a lot of chance of getting it enforced. I think fundamentally it's unconscionable as a matter of Canadian law for it to be enforced against Omar.
Why do you say that, Mr. Phillips?
Because the entire finding against him in Utah is built on statements made by Mr. Khadr or Omar when he was in Guantanamo and in Bagram when he'd been tortured. All of that was fused into a forced confession and guilty plea that allowed him the only chance he had of getting out of Guantanamo alive.
And the settlement that they were given by that U.S. court, he had no standing in that case either.
No, I don't know how they could have. It just strikes me as being profoundly unfair when he's detained in custody elsewhere, can't travel into the United States to defend himself. The whole thing was, I think, ill-considered.
Would there be, because I've been doing some reading on this, obviously, and I guess there's also a suggestion that if he were to have to be forced to give over money, that would actually go counter to a Canadian policy decision, a government policy decision about the fact that his rights had been breached.
And I share that view.
Okay.
Very much so.
So there's a number of legal points for you to fight back.
Yes. I think they have a very uphill battle.
Okay. In spite of that, as I said, they do seem to want to fight the battle. I had Mr. Morris on the show earlier this week. He in particular, although I'm sure Ms. Speer would agree, would like him to give over some of the assets, some of the settlement he received from the government. What is the likelihood that might happen?
Omar can choose to do what he wants to do with his proceeds. My view is that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the facts surrounding what happened in Guantanamo, in the firefight where Omar, as a child, was apprehended by the Americans. And I think if you actually unpack the facts and the forensic evidence, there's really nothing there that points to Omar as having done anything other than be present for the firefight. And it just strikes me that if people aren't looking at those facts, they're misapprehending what obligations, morally or otherwise, Mr. Khadr or Omar has to the Speers family or Mr. Morris.
So he is also, if I understand correctly, trying to have his plea overturned in the United States, that the settlement, the guilty plea that he agreed to in order to get out of Guantanamo Bay, is that still ongoing?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, so if he were to give over money to Ms. Speers, say he decided he wanted to do that, could that not also be viewed then as a sort of admission of doing something wrong? Would that create legal problems for him in that case?
Yes, I mean, if he asked me my advice, I would say not to do it.
So what do you make then of all the many Canadians who say he should not have received the money and he should give it to the families?
Well, they aren't apprehending the facts. They haven't even. People need to be properly informed of this, and there's several articles out there that describe the forensic situation that appeared after the firefight, and it's not supportive of the conviction of Omar for anything. As a result of which, you have to rely on confessional statements he made under duress as a child, and were forced out of him in a plea deal that was entirely fabricated to make him admit to those things.
Is Mr. Khadr, are you willing to be in court for potentially years to protect his assets?
Well, he's got Mr. Whitling helping him with that right now, and if called upon, I will help him as well.
And I would imagine some of that money has to go to pay you and other lawyers, because he's had a lot of lawyers for a long period of time.
And I can't answer that. That's a matter of solicitor-client privilege.
Okay. Are you surprised at what the reaction has been since the settlement was announced?
Yes, and it strikes me as it was orchestrated by someone inside government that leaked information to cause the embarrassment to the Trudeau government for doing what it did, which frankly I think was recognizing the justice of the situation and the need to send a message to itself and to future Canadian governments that this can't be tolerated again.
Do you think, as the Prime Minister suggested yesterday, that if has had gone ahead and not reached a settlement, that the payout would have been much greater for the federal government?
The court would have decided that ultimately, but my view was it could well have been much higher, and they would have spent substantially more costs as we proceeded.
The fact that the Supreme Court offered no remedy to any of this back in 2010, they didn't even suggest the executive should repatriate Omar Khadr. Lots of people have looked to that as a suggestion that no settlement was ever going to be needed, that no remedy needed to be given to Omar Khadr. What do you say to them?
I think you have to look at it in context. At that point, he was being held in Guantanamo, not even having faced a trial yet. And the idea of repatriation, which was suggested by Canada as being appropriate, by the Supreme Court of Canada as being appropriate, was left ultimately as a remedy, as a discretion to the Canadian government. And then Prime Minister Harper chose to simply send a message to the U.S. saying, please don't use those statements. I think it was wholly inadequate to what the Supreme Court of Canada found to be wrongs. And as the situation unfolds and Omar comes back to Canada, is able to recant his confessional statements and start looking at how he wound up where he was, then the Supreme Court of Canada finding still stands of his abhorrent treatment and the violation of his rights, and that remedy then expands. And I think that was what was recognized as we moved into the settlement of the case.
Okay, I have to put another question to you, because as I was joking with you before, you're a busy lawyer right now. You're also representing 5 CSIS officers and analysts who cannot be identified, who've just filed a $35 million lawsuit against CSIS, alleging they've faced homophobic, racist, Islamophobic treatment. What can you tell me about how serious these allegations are from what your clients have told you?
The statement of claim, if you read it, which is before the courts, lays out in some detail the treatment that was meted out to my clients, all of whom are in minority categories, including Muslims and LGBT and Black. And the treatment by their managers was terrible. And the response by the managers when complaints were made was just as bad. So the claim speaks for itself. My clients, just so you're aware, my clients are very concerned for their own well-being, but had to take the step they did, since they've tried for a long, long time to get some sort of informal resolution internal to the organization, and it just never happened. So they were forced to court.
So, because the CSIS statement from last night from the director seemed to suggest that there were that complaints could be made inside the organization and solutions would be found. But what you're telling me is that just didn't happen.
Well, it was tried, and the results were scandalous in terms of not addressing the issues that were raised by certainly one of the clients, and that's described in detail in the claim.
Do you think that others might join the claim?
Well, I'm not. That's something that we're going to have to see how that plays out, and it's going to depend how Canada and the agency responds to us.
How difficult is it, the fact that you can't reveal anything about these claimants? Their identities have to be kept secret because of their jobs.
It makes it very difficult, and it's hard to keep names straight and positions straight, but we're trying to do our best that we can.
Okay. Mr. Phillips, you're very good to take the time on both those topics. I do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.